We are counting down the top 10 matches in Summerslam history and have reached the top 3. Earlier in the countdown, I talked about the excellent main event from Summerslam 2013 between John Cena and Daniel Bryan. As great as that match was, there was another match on that show even better. In fact, I believe it was my match of the year in WWE in 2013. It was marketed as the best versus the beast. As in the best in the world, and no, I'm not talking about Shane McMahon. CM Punk against Brock Lesnar in a no disqualification match comes in at number 3 in my countdown of the top 10 greatest SummerSlam matches of all time. Brock Lesnar had just come back to the company the year before. He spent 7 years, 8 years, something like that, away from WWE, was locked in a bitter legal dispute with them. That was resolved. And he came back. He came back after a stint in the UFC, and he had the diverticulitis. After WrestleMania 28, he was back. His very first match on pay-per-view, he lost to John Cena. One of the best matches. Actually, that probably was also the match of the year in WWE, my match of the year, in 2012. Even though he lost, which is still just inexplicable to me. But he went on to feud with Triple H. He beat Triple H. Then Triple H beat him at WrestleMania. Then they closed out that feud. And Cena and Triple H, I believe, were the only two people that he had lost to since coming back. CM Punk, when he cut that pipe bomb promo back in 2011, which just changed the whole trajectory of his entire career and kept him in WWE and caused him to re-sign, he admitted in that promo that he was a Paul Heyman guy. This is at a time when Heyman had also not been with the company for a number of years. Heyman went to bat for Punk when Punk was still in developmental. He was a big fan of his. He was a friend of his. And when people were trying to get rid of Punk and conspiring against him and talking shit about him in the meetings and stuff, Heyman was one of his biggest advocates. Shawn Michaels may have single-handedly saved Punk's career, if you know that story. He was sitting in a meeting once, and they were talking about Punk or talking about getting rid of him or cutting him or something, and Shawn just kind of piped up and said, well, look, I mean, you should do something with this guy. Right? You've got him, you should just do something with him, use him. Or something to that effect. So there are stories like that about some things that were said and people who kind of stuck up for him, and that really saved Punk from just being cut before he even made the main roster. Heyman was one of those people, and Punk never forgot that. He was always a Heyman fan. He always considered himself a Heyman guy. Well, he won the championship from Alberto Del Rio, Survivor Series 2011, Madison Square Garden, and he went on to hold that championship for 434 days. And he defended it against Chris Jericho. He defended it against Daniel Bryan, a few other people. But he was never really positioned as the guy. He had a very Chris Jericho-esque championship run. Even at WrestleMania 28, he defended against Jericho. It wasn't the main event. Because how can you compete with the first ever John Cena Rock match in Miami at WrestleMania? That's the main event. Title or not, that's the main event. Undertaker and Triple H. End of an era, Hell in a Cell. Punk was the champ, and he was probably slotted third from the top at best. And such was the story of his run. He had some great matches with Daniel Bryan. Their match at Over the Limit in May of 2012. One of my favorite matches that year. But he just was never really positioned as the guy. And then came Raw 1000 in July of 2012. That was the night that Punk turned heel. He laid out the Rock, and it planted the seeds for the eventual demise of his championship run when Rock came back, and Rock beat him for the title at the Royal Rumble. But he went heel, and Paul Heyman started managing CM Punk. It was not long after he linked up with Heyman. Heyman now had two clients. He had Brock Lesnar, who was almost never around, and he had CM Punk. And there was never any interaction between the two of them. You never saw them in the same place at the same time. It wasn't like they did some old school Dangerous Alliance wrestling promo stuff where you had Heyman in the ring cutting a promo and standing behind him was Punk and Lesnar. I always thought that would have been cool. They never did anything like that. And Heyman had a few other clients during his time with WWE. He had Cesaro, he had Ryback, he had Curtis Axel, who briefly won the Intercontinental title, but all three of those things were failures. All three of those experiments were failures. It's no wonder that people say, oh, this person should be a Heyman guy, this person should be a Heyman girl. Why? When have they proven that they have the ability to properly book a Paul Heyman guy or a Paul Heyman anybody other than Brock Lesnar? They haven't. So I've kind of given up on that whole idea. If they were ever going to have a Heyman girl, Ronda Rousey would have been the perfect person for that role. But that's neither here nor there. So, Punk loses the championship to The Rock. He loses to him again the next month. He loses to The Undertaker earlier that year at WrestleMania 29. 3 straight pay-per-views. This after holding the championship for 434 consecutive days. In storyline, Punk went home. He disappeared. And he did. He took time off for a couple months. A few months later, Chris Jericho calls him out. Paul Heyman accepts the challenge on CM Punk's behalf. If I remember the storyline, I think he did that without Punk's knowledge, and that was sort of the beginning of the end of the relationship between Punk and Heyman. Punk did come back, he did beat Jericho, but after that, Punk asked Heyman to stop coming to the ring with him for his matches, and the two began to drift apart when all of a sudden, Brock Lesnar shows up one night, lays out Punk with an F5. Heyman pleads ignorance. He basically says, look, Brock does his own thing. It's nothing personal. But this led to Heyman turning on Punk in the Money in the Bank match, and that led us to where we are here. Punk and Lesnar at SummerSlam. There were a lot of people going in who found it very hard to take this match seriously because of the size difference between Punk and Lesnar. I don't think up to this point Lesnar had been matched up for a program with somebody as small as compared to him as CM Punk. He wrestled John Cena, he wrestled Triple H, he went on to wrestle Undertaker and Big Show, Kane, all these people, Strowman, who were as big or bigger than him. Now he's in there with a small guy. And this is back when Brock, go back and watch this match and you'll see what I'm talking about. This is back at a time when Brock was clearly not being drug tested, and he was as jacked as he has been maybe ever. Compare his physique today to the way he was in 2013 when he would come out for a big pay-per-view match. It looked like you put a pin in him, he would pop. He's a big guy. Punk was the polar opposite. Punk was, a smaller guy compared to him anyhow, but just physique-wise, there was no comparison. Punk looked like a guy who never saw a gym a day in his life compared to Brock Lesnar. But by the time this match was over, all doubts had been erased. Because the way they worked this match was just pitch perfect. It felt like Punk was in the fight of his life. Lesnar was dominating most of it the first half. Punk fought back, Brock sold for him. Gave him more than he's given a lot of other people since then. Punk was so obsessed with getting his hands on Paul Heyman throughout the match that it ended up costing him in the end. Punk tried for the GTS, Brock countered it into a Kimura, the same move he had used the year before at SummerSlam, to beat Triple H and break his arm. So the fans completely bought into the idea that this could be the finish. Punk slipped out, caught Lesnar in a triangle. Brock almost tapped. He muscled up Punk, gave him a running powerbomb to break the hold. Brock then borrows from the old Eddie Guerrero playbook. He learned something from his match with Eddie Guerrero all those years earlier. He gives Punk the Three Amigos. This was back before Lesnar was just nothing but German suplexes. He actually had some other suplexes that he would bust out every now and then. So he gave him the Three Amigos. Lesnar goes outside, he grabs a chair. Punk takes him out with a dive off the top rope, starts assaulting Brock, lacing into him with this chair. It's no DQ, so anything goes. Back inside, Brock gets a hold of the chair, but before he could use it, Punk delivers a low blow. And Punk hits a big dive off the top rope with the chair in his hand. He lands on Lesnar with it. Punk is just waylaying Lesnar with this chair. When Paul Heyman gets on the apron, he reaches into the ring and he grabs the chair out of Punk's hands. Brock catches Punk in position for an F5. Punk is holding on to Heyman's his jacket or his tie. Lesnar is screaming, Paul, let go, not realizing that Punk is the one who's holding on to Heyman. And Heyman's trying to explain to him, he's got me, it's not me, it's him. So Punk slips out, he gets Brock up, he hits the go to sleep, and the place explodes. A tremendous near fall, broken up by Paul Heyman. Punk chases after him, ring around the ring, Punk slides back in, Brock scoops him up for an F5. But on the way down, Punk counters it into a DDT for another near fall. The Staples Center, when you go back and watch this match, it's great how it builds, right? Because the fans were into this really from the opening bell. But as the match progresses, you always want the crowd to get more and more and more into it. The last thing you want, I would imagine, as a performer, is as the match goes on, people get bored and they become less invested and they do a wave or they start chanting stuff. That's the worst. But they got more and more into this as the match went on, to the point where at this point the Staples Center was as loud as you will ever hear it. These people were so into this. They were losing their minds. Punk gets Brock in the Anaconda Vice. Is Lesnar going to tap out? And again, Paul Heyman gets involved. He slides in. Punk lets go of the hold. He grabs Heyman. He's got him by the head. For whatever reason, he sticks his fingers in Heyman's mouth, which is just very unsanitary. I don't know if he was trying to give him the mandible claw or what he was trying to do exactly. But he nails Heyman with a right hand, and then he makes a cardinal mistake. It's bad enough he let go of the hold, but instead of going back to Brock, he decides to put Heyman in the vice. Dumb babyface syndrome. Although in this case you could say his emotions got the best of him. He was dying to get his hands on Paul Heyman. He made a mistake. And it gave Lesnar a chance to hit him with a chair from behind. A few more chair shots. Brock hits Punk with an F5 onto the chair, and he gets the pin. And that's all she wrote. CM Punk gave Brock Lesnar the fight of his life in this match, and the people had no problem buying into it hook, line, and sinker. You know you hit a home run when the match is over and the crowd is chanting for a guy who lost. They're chanting for the guy who lost. And both guys, when they got back through the curtain, they got a standing ovation from the wrestlers in the back. Brock Lesnar needed a win like this, which is funny to say, now in retrospect, but at the time, even though he did beat Triple H at the end of their feud, he was hardly looked at as somebody who was unbeatable. And he needed a win like this when you consider what they had lined up for him at WrestleMania, even though I'm sure at that point they had no idea yet that he was going to break the streak. But given what ended up happening, what he went on to do, he needed a win like this, and it set him on a course as this unbeatable monster. Punk, meanwhile, he never made it to WrestleMania the following year. For his match with Triple H, he walked out 2 months earlier, and he has not been back since. Even though the crowds continue to chant his name 5 years later. But this was truly one of the all-time great SummerSlam matches, and it was hard. I did waffle whether or not to put this at number 4 and put Bret Hart and Mr. Perfect at number 3, because that is just one of my all-time favorite matches. And when I think of SummerSlam, that is it's one of the matches, if not the match, that pops into my head. But that does not make it automatically the best match. And having watched both of them back, I said I've got to put this at number 3 because it's just that great of a match.